All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. We're always excited when it's time to catch up with Hearts in the Ice. So we've got a really awesome event today. The feature is going to be weather, but we're connecting with Sunniva Sorby and her expedition partner, Hilde Strom. They've been living in Svalbard now for several months, living in a remote trapper's cabin called Bamsebu. In total, they're going to spend 9 months there, becoming the first women to overwinter solo there. So it's a pretty incredible accomplishment so far, and they've still got a lot of winter action to go. So along the way, they're going to be taking part in citizen science projects, and each month we get to connect with them for live events and with different experts. So before we introduce Hilde and Sunniva, they shared a video with me. So we're able to connect with them via voice, but they shared this awesome video with me today. And I think you're going to get a real feel to how wild the weather is right now. So let's get that going. All right, let's bring back that screen share. Hilde, Sunniva, it looks like some wild weather. You talked about polar bears coming to visit you. It sounds like you're having an incredible time up there.
Yeah, it's been a very exciting, today is 120 days that we've been here at Bamsebu, 140 kilometers away from the nearest neighbor, and so our visitors have been the polar bears. It's been
All right, Hilde and Sunniva, can you still hear me? No, we just lost them. All right. Well, boys and girls, that is the adventure of trying to connect to such a remote location on the planet. So they are right up in the Arctic Circle, and they're relying on a satellite system to connect with us. So we're going to probably have this happen throughout. We might have them talk to us for a little bit and then lose them for a little bit. But luckily for today, we have our weather guest speaker hanging out with us. So George Kourounis is a Canadian adventurer and explorer. Now, most people run away from extreme weather and extreme places, but George goes in the other direction. He runs right towards it, usually with his camera in tow, whether it's a volcano, lake of acid, extreme weather in the poles, even chasing hurricanes. So, George, it's so awesome to have you joining us live today. I know you have a cool little presentation for us, and we're excited to learn a little bit about your extreme weather experiences.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Joe. The fact that we're losing them on the satellite really shows how remote and difficult it is to operate in some of these parts of the world, even with the technology that we have today, with all of the satellites that are orbiting around, all these communication systems that we have. It's still really hard to connect to parts of the world. And I think that's really great. That really shows us how much there is still left to discover, to explore. There are parts of the world that are really difficult. And this particular spot where Sunniva and Hilde are is exactly one of those places. Svalbard lies entirely within the Arctic Circle. The most southern part of Svalbard is at 74 degrees north. And sort of to put that in perspective, we're talking some of these high latitudes up near the northern part of Greenland is sort of an equal latitude. So long summers, long winters, and not much in between. Right now, it's January, so it is cold. From that video, you could see they're bundled up, huddling together. In places like Svalbard, they get a lot of wind, and they were talking about polar bears. So during the summer months, when the sea ice isn't as plentiful, those polar bears will come ashore and they'll spend a lot of their summertime there. But during the winter, they've got free run. The sea ice is more extensive. They can come and go. And if they smell something interesting, like, for example, whatever it is you're cooking in your cabin, they can smell that from miles away and they will come in and they will investigate. They're very curious animals. They thrive in these frigid temperatures. They are impervious to frostbite. They love it in the cold. and they love nothing more than investigating these curious smells. So I hope that they're taking their precautions up there, their polar bear safety precautions, very seriously. I'm sure they are. And it's certainly, I can't imagine what it'd be like to have a polar bear circling my cabin when you know you've got no place to run in the middle of the winter there. I think they're connected back in, Joe.
They did just jump back in. So Hilde and Sunniva, can you hear me?
We're back, guys.
All right. So George just did a little introduction. While we have a good connection, if you guys want to do a quick introduction and talk a little bit about the last little while.
Yeah, sorry about that. We've had a lot of aurora activity here, and we're not sure if it impacts technology, but it might. So we've been here for 120 days now, and Hilda's going to talk a little bit about the weather, but a lot of people have been wondering what in the world we do when we have 24 hours of darkness, which we are in right now in the polar night, with very limited visibility except when the moon shows up, like now. So what we're doing is we're doing quite a few citizen science projects, even though it's dark. One of them is wildlife observation, and we've seen quite a few polar bears in the last week. We're also measuring the ice. It's changing quite a bit, and we've seen the ice freeze faster here than normal. We're flying a drone. It was minus 24 degrees yesterday, and we have a pre-planned flight path that we fly the drone in, and they're going to use the thermal imaging to measure lots of things, including ice core. And then we're also doing a lot of aurora photography. It is absolutely magical here with the northern lights. It's like showering us with all sorts of colors from the magnetism here. So we're staying very, very busy, even though we can't go very far, and even though it's very, very cold outside.
All right. Well, Hilde and Sunniva, keep talking. And while you're talking, you mentioned the drone. So I'm going to share a picture on my screen that you shared with me, flying the drone with the auroras. So I'm going to spotlight my screen, and while you talk, the students can see that cool picture.
Yeah, perfect. So the picture you see we took last night, it was a little bit aurora. It was a moon, so it was really light outside, and you can see the white dots because the drone is blinking, so we can see the drone everywhere, also in the complete darkness that we have here just now. It's a polar night. So, yeah, the weather, the temperature has been lower than usual, and the weather is really everything for us. I mean, that decides we're going to be outside. We had 33 meters per second. That's more than gale. That's a hurricane. And we are in a very small Trappers Cup that's not insulated, so we had a hard time keeping ourselves warm. And our food froze during night. So, yeah, and imagine that in Arctic things are going the wrong direction. If you had an ice cream in your cooler and that all of a sudden became like a milkshake all the time because it's far too mild. So the warmer temperature that we see up here also impact the reindeer because it's usually never rained during winter, but now the last 10 years it has been raining and it freezes over on the ground. And the reindeer has a hard time getting the grass to eat. And the polar bears need ice on the sea in order to catch the seal. And the seal is the main food for the polar bear. And now we have seen lately, also me and Sunniva, while we were here, we saw a polar bear catch and kill the reindeer, which is not normal. So they're trying to adapt to a warmer climate. They're trying to find other food sources.
All right. And I can tell that this time the wind isn't as strong. Last time we talked, I could hear the wind whistling through the cabin in the background. So I'm thinking the wind might have died down a little bit for you.
Yeah, it's the wind is probably 1 meter per second right now, and it's when it howls, it finds its way through every little crevice in this cabin. But right now it's quiet. It's a very peaceful sort of quiet.
All right. Well, Hilde and Sunniva, before we let George take over for a little bit, Sunniva, you had a story about the first encounter with the polar bear that you've shared before, and I think it's a neat one to share with students.
Well, yes, that was quite a, Hilde's been living in Svalbard for 25 years, and Sunniva has been living in Canada. And we don't have polar bears in Squamish anyway, which is where I'm from in British Columbia. And I'm here. My first encounter was at midnight over a month ago, and I walked outside, as I normally do. We're checking out the lights, and I just turned on our little spotlight outside, and it scared a polar bear that was right around the corner from the cabin. And it was like 2 meters in front of me, so 6 feet in front of me, and it almost like for a split second looked my way, and then it tore off towards the shoreline, and then started heading south. And I have to tell you, if the heart doesn't go into your throat at that moment, you're not alive. It was both a feeling of, I can't believe I'm seeing this, to, oh my God, what a beautiful creature. So it was a lot of emotions all at once. And we took a flare gun out and fired off a flare to scare it off. But they're around us. There are quite a few tracks around the hut. So we know they're here, and we have a couple of cameras set up outside to capture, hopefully, them while we're sleeping.
All right. Well, Hilde and Sunniva, I'm going to throw things over to George. He's already given a little introduction, but I bet he's ready to jump into a little presentation for us. All right, George, we'll throw things your way.
Thank you. Sunniva actually met and I met up in the Arctic, traveling through the Northwest Passage. So it's a real honor and pleasure for me to be here today helping with this. And what I'm going to do is, you guys see that?
Yeah, looks good.
Awesome. So yeah, I'm a storm chaser, and I specialize in documenting extreme weather all over the world, from hurricanes to tornadoes and such, and some of the polar regions. So let's get a look exactly where is Svalbard. So looking at a map here, we've got Europe. Svalbard is part of Norway. So Norway is there in the light green. And then up at the top of the screen, all the way to the top, you've got that dark green. And that dark green area, that archipelago of island, that grouping of islands is Svalbard. So that's how far north they are, way above Iceland and all of mainland Europe. And more specifically, let me just, here we are. So the ladies are at Bamsebu, or Bamsebu, however it's pronounced. And it's sort of at the bottom left on this little bay. And that is a bit of a protected area, which is great for them, because as bad as the weather gets there, you want to try and protect yourself from it as much as you can. And it just so happens that because of the position of where Svalbard is, the western portion, the part on the left side of the screen, is actually a bit warmer than the right side, or the eastern portion of the archipelago, this grouping of islands. And there's a very specific reason for that. And it has to do, well, I'll explain in a second. First, let's talk about temperatures. How warm is it? Well, in the summertime, from 3 to 7 degrees Celsius, 37 to 46 Fahrenheit. So that's not very warm by most people's standards. That's about as warm as it gets. The record high temperature was 21 Celsius, or 70 degrees in July. And having a 70 degree or 21 Celsius record warm temperature, that tells you that this place is pretty far north. Now, in terms of the average in the winter, minus 13 to 20 Celsius, which is pretty cold, 8 to minus 4 Fahrenheit. But the record low is a bone-chilling minus 46. And that is so cold that if you were to step outside with a boiling cup of water and were to throw it up in the air, that boiling hot water would freeze into ice crystals instantly before the water hits the ground. So that gives you an idea of how cold it really can get there. And the reason why the western portion of Svalbard is warmer than the eastern portion is because of the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is the warm ocean water in the Atlantic that comes up from the tropics, from the equator, down near places like Cuba and Dominican Republic. And that warm water goes up the east coast of the United States and Canada, spreads across the Atlantic, and hits parts of Europe, including Iceland and Great Britain. And that's why Great Britain, even though it's pretty far north, doesn't really get a lot of snow. And if you look way up in the top right-hand corner of the frame, there's Svalbard. So it gets a little bit of that warm water that comes up from the Gulf Stream. Now, one of the concerns that we have is, of course, the ocean water is getting warmer. And as the ocean is getting warmer, a lot of that heat energy is being transferred from the equator, where the sun is strongest and heats that water tremendously, and it gets carried by these currents, the North Atlantic drift, it carries it up towards places like Svalbard. And so that's part of the reason why the Arctic is melting at a rate that is just really so much faster than the rest of the world. It's warming at like double the rate of the rest of the world through climate change. And Svalbard is known for its glaciers. There are lots of glaciers. Glaciers, of course, are these very slow moving, basically a river of solid ice. As the snow falls up in the mountains of Svalbard, it gets compressed under its own weight. That snow turns into ice, and over hundreds of years or thousands of years, that ice can get very thick, and it wants to flow down from the mountains very slowly into the sea. And so that's one of the main things that we're seeing in Svalbard is we're seeing these glaciers are melting. We're seeing the ice getting thinner. 60% of Svalbard, it's covered in glaciers. And some of these are the fastest moving glaciers on Earth. And part of the reason why they move so fast is because that ice melts, and it can actually cause the water from that melted ice to tunnel through these glaciers, and they reach the rock below the glacier, and it acts like a lubricant. Imagine if you're walking outside on a wet day, it can be slippery out, right? Well, the same thing happens with these glaciers. And so these lubricated glaciers are moving faster because of this water that is between them and the rock below. And so that can cause tremendous changes. And one of the interesting things that happens with glaciers is they can create their own weather. There are these winds called katabatic winds. And you have this cold air from the top of the glaciers that is more dense than the warmer air around it. And it can come flowing down off of these glaciers and create these tremendous winds. And I've experienced these in Greenland. It blows like a hurricane sometimes. And it all has to do with this denser, heavier air that flows rapidly off of these glaciers. So not only is the weather affecting the ice, but the ice is affecting the weather, which is really cool. So it's this sort of, we've come full circle. And because there's so much ice on Svalbard, we can actually dig, and scientists do this all the time. They dig these holes in the ice, and they can look at this ancient ice, and they can tell how warm it was hundreds or thousands of years ago. And because of these time capsules that's found in the ice, we've learned that in the past 100 years, the temperature there has gone up by about 6 degrees Celsius or 10 degrees, almost 11 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a lot. And a good portion of that, 7 degrees Fahrenheit or 4 Celsius, has happened just in the past 30 years alone. So we're seeing rates of change here that are, like I said before, double the warming of the global rate. So I'm just going to turn my screen sharing off here. Stop sharing. That should be off now.
Yep, you're back.
And so Svalbard is this unique microclimate there. So you've got cold in the east, a little bit warmer in the west, but the whole thing is getting warmer and warmer every single year. And even though we get these bone-chilling temperatures of almost minus 50, and at minus 40, the Celsius scale and the Fahrenheit scale, they meet. So if it's minus 40 out, it doesn't matter what scale you use, whether in the US or the rest of the world using metric, minus 40 is minus 40. And even though they do get those bone-chilling temperatures from time to time, the climate is the average of the temperatures over a span of at least 30 years. So we're seeing double the change in the Arctic areas. And that's part of what the Hearts in the Ice expedition is looking to do, is to help try and document this. Because Svalbard is so remote and so difficult to get around in, it's not so easy to get a lot of these data points to see what's happening. And the fact that they're spending 9 months there really will give us an excellent source of data, a point on these lines, and measuring the temperatures and how they're changing throughout not just the summer, but the winter as well. So kudos to them for enduring what has got to be a dark, cold, lonely winter in a place that I would love to briefly visit, but I don't know if I would want to spend 9 months living there.
All right, and I think that's a good. Oh, that satellite sound is never a good sound. We're about to lose them. Yeah, let me see. They're still. Hilde and Sunniva, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, they're there.
All right, perfect. So George just did an awesome presentation, a little bit about the climate and the changes in Svalbard. And I remember from some of our earlier sessions, maybe you can speak to this a little bit, that the winter wasn't setting in as quickly. You had kind of warmer temperatures that you were experiencing.
Yeah, yes, that's right. We had warmer than normal temperatures in the very beginning of our stay. And I'll let Hilde speak to that. Yeah, well, the temperature, I didn't feel the cost control, but yeah, in the start of our stay, we had some weird weather, but what I have experienced the last 10 years is a huge difference in the temperature. We have seen for 100 and maybe you know this, George, but I think it's more than 120 months in a row with a higher temperature than the year before. So this is really dramatic. But as it is now, I don't know what it should be, but.
Okay, so we lost a little bit of audio there, but that record of 120 days of higher than normal temperatures is definitely an interesting base point, and it doesn't bode well for a region that's warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet.
Exactly.
All right. Well, boys and girls, we are going to turn things over to a little Q&A action. So we have an awesome group of classrooms joining us from Canada and the US. We lost Hilde and Sunniva's signal, so hopefully they're able to come back. But for now, we can direct questions to George about extreme weather, about some of his travels as well. When Hilde and Sunniva do jump back in, if you have any questions about what it's like to be overwintering in the Arctic, the extreme weather, the polar bears, the food, the darkness, I'm sure they're more than happy to answer some of those questions for you. So let's get to our first classroom and jump right into it. So we're going to go to Red Deer, Alberta. Mrs. Franz's grade 5s are hanging out with us. Let's get that microphone turned on. How we doing, Alberta?
Good. Our weather is cold. It's minus 40. With wind, it's minus 49. Minus 49 with wind chill in Red Deer, Alberta today.
Wow.
Yeah, it's been very cold in Alberta.
Yeah. Okay, ask your question. How do you defend yourself if there's a polar bear attack?
How do you defend yourself from a polar bear attack? Well, a couple of things. First and foremost, you want to make sure that you don't get into that situation in the first place. So you're always, if you're in an area where there are polar bears, you always want to be alert and scout and make sure that if there is a polar bear on the horizon in the distance, you want to steer clear of it. So number one, try and avoid the bear. Number two, and I was taught this technique by a good friend of mine who is a bear expert. And we were up in northern Manitoba with a polar bear in front of us. And the polar bear was walking towards us. And he told me that you want to make yourself big to try and intimidate the bear. If you turn and run, then the polar bear will think that you are prey and they will run after you. So you want to try and avoid running away from the polar bears, even as counterintuitive and as scary as that sounds. You don't want to run away from a bear. I think they're back on, Joe.
Yep, we've got them. So we should be good.
Yeah, we are. Yep.
Yep, so we're open.
Yeah, that's a good thing, George. Never run away from because
All right, perfect. So we're going to jump to our next classroom now. So questions can be directed towards the Hearts in the Ice ladies in Svalbard or towards George. So let's jump into our next classroom. We're going to go to North Palm Beach in Florida. So I imagine it's a little bit warmer than Red Deer, Alberta today. Mr. Laveau's group, let's get your microphone turned on. How are we doing, boys and girls?
Say hi.
Hi!
Want to ask a question? You had a question about drones.
Does it ever get too cold to fly the drones? Yes.
We'll find out, ladies.
So Hilde and Sunniva, that question's for you. Does it ever get too cold to fly the drones?
Yes, absolutely. It's funny you asked that question. It's a great question because we're looking at the user's manual last night, and I'm thinking, I wonder if minus 24 Celsius is too cold to fly the drone. And it's recommended to fly it in temperatures no colder than minus 20. But it always returns to home. We have a pre-planned flight that's 16 minutes long that we repeat every time we do fly the drone, so we can collect data continuously over the same area. So the answer is yes. There is it can be too cold to fly the drone, but we had really calm conditions, no wind, and we figured it would just come back home to us when the battery was starting to die. So we were good to go.
All right, great question in Florida. Moving down, Mrs. Wu's class, grade 7's hanging out in British Columbia with us today. Awesome. Let me get that microphone turned on. How we doing, BC?
Good. Hi. My question. Hello, boy. My question is for George. So, what's some of the worst weather you've been?
Okay, so I bet you we can put this question to both. George, if you want to answer about an extreme weather that you've been in, then maybe Hilde and Sunniva, you can talk about some of the storms you've had.
Right. So the worst weather that I've encountered, that's a pretty broad topic. As someone who's been a storm chaser for 20 years, I've been in the middle of some of the strongest hurricanes, including Hurricane Katrina. I was in the strongest part of Hurricane Katrina. I have witnessed the largest tornado that has ever been documented. It's in the Guinness Book of World Records. It was 2.6 miles wide, or 4.3 kilometers in metric, absolutely massive. The coldest temperatures I have ever experienced was in a chamber, a special cold chamber. I was filming for a television program, and it was minus 110 degrees Celsius. And I think the biggest hail I ever experienced was bigger than softballs. So pretty much the far ends of the spectrum on anything you can think of weather-wise.
All right, and turning it over to Hilde and Sunniva, how's some of those storms been treating you?
Well, we've had some really wicked weather up here, and it's shaking. I mean, you were on the call with us last month, and you could hear the wind whistling. So it really does shake it up here, and we're kind of afraid of flying objects. We have everything tied down outside, but we'd be a little bit nervous for things to break free, and that can kill you actually. The coldest temperature I've been in is George, you have me beat. A cold chamber does not sound fun, but I was at the South Pole today, our anniversary actually of the first women's team to reach the South Pole, January 14th, 1993, and it was minus 76 degrees Celsius. That was 5 hours. And I did this. It's probably been here at Bamsebu, and you've seen lots of weather.
I've seen a lot of weather, but I haven't experienced that cold temperatures. Maybe minus up here, minus 40. But it usually doesn't get that cold up here. But with the wind chill, it gets really, really cold. So the temperature and the wind, in addition to that, but I've seen some wild storms here out on Svalbard for more than 20 years.
All right. Great question from BC. Let's jump to our next class. We're going to go to Enid, Oklahoma. So, George, you might pass through this area.
Enid many times.
Chasing.
Many times.
Very cool. So, Mrs. Irwin's group, grade 4, is hanging out with us. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, Oklahoma?
Good.
All right, who's up?
My question is what kind of changes happen to the landscape while you are at the Arctic?
What kind of changes have happened while you've been there to the landscape?
All right, we might have to put a pin in that because I'm just noticing that Hilde and Sunniva's signal has dropped out. So the second they come back in, we'll jump to that question.
Yeah.
George, you might be able to speak a little bit to that. Either
Yeah,
things you've seen or what people have told you.
Well, I've been to many of the polar regions, and one of the things that we're seeing in terms of longer term is not just less of the sea ice. We're seeing less and less of the sea ice, but also the sea ice is getting thinner and thinner. And you get some ice that comes and goes every single year. That's the surface of the ocean will freeze in that sea ice. But there's some of the ice that lasts multiple years. And that ice tends to be thicker and farther north. And we're seeing less and less of that every year. And one thing I just want to quickly touch on, I see they're coming back on, is wind chill. And I want to explain a little bit about how wind chill works. Why does it feel colder when it's windy out? Well, we are warm-blooded creatures. Our body generates heat. And so there's a tiny, tiny, tiny layer of air that surrounds your body that is warmed by your body heat. And on a windy day, that layer of warm air gets blown away by the wind, and it can't be warmed up again so fast by your skin. And so that's why it feels colder when it's windy.
All right, and Hilde and Sunniva have joined us again. And so there's a question from Oklahoma, and they're wondering how the landscape's changed since you've been there, from maybe when you were dropped off to what it's kind of looking like now.
Can you repeat the question, Joe? How has something changed since we've been here?
How has the landscape changed since you've been there, from when you were dropped off to now?
Oh, yes. No, that's a great question. The landscape, we were talking about that when the full moon came on Friday, just for the first
Uh-oh.
All right.
And then they're gone.
All right, we'll put a pin in that question. We will save it because I think that's a good question. I'd like to hear the answers, but we're going to jump to Alice in Ontario while we wait. Ms. McKay's got some fourth graders hanging out with her. Let's get that microphone turned on. How are we doing, boys and girls?
Good.
All right, who's up?
Awesome. Go.
Tell them what it is. I don't know. We don't have
What is the toughest weather of wintering over?
All right. So you're wondering about the toughest part of overwintering, or the toughest thing about the weather?
Just clarify your question. Clarify.
Oh, say it again. Okay. What is the toughest weather of wintering over?
Okay.
Joe, I can touch on that.
Sure, absolutely.
So how long have they been there? Been 120 days already.
20 days, yep.
120 days. From a climatology perspective, they have not reached the worst part of winter yet. So it's into February and March when you're actually going to experience the coldest temperatures there. Even though winter comes, we hit December 21st, and we're into winter, according to the axis of tilt of the Earth and such. But it takes a while. There's a bit of a delay between when the planet Earth enters what we consider winter and when the coldest part of winter hits. So December, in the Northern Hemisphere, December is usually not the coldest month. It's usually much later. We're talking February into the beginning of March. So even though they have been experiencing these cold, frigid temperatures, I hate to say, ladies, I wish you were on the phone to hear this, the worst is yet to come.
I have a feeling that they're anticipating that they're not quite out of the woods yet. So that's a really good question. And I want to add just a little bit from the past conversations that we've had doing these calls each month, a little bit about some of the hard ships that they're experiencing living in the cabin. And one of them is bathing and hygiene. So there's no shower, there's no toilet, So they've had to come up with creative ways to keep clean while up there. So maybe we can ask them about that when they pop back in, and about some of the food that they're having up there, because a lot of things to think about when you're in the colder weather like that. And in fact, we're in luck. I think we have Hilde and Sunniva back in with us.
Yeah, we're back. Sorry about that. We'll try to keep our answers a little shorter because it seems like their satellites are not too great today.
All right. Well, if you want to try and jump into that landscape question while we have you.
Can you repeat that, Joe?
Do you want to try and jump into that landscape question while we have you, about the change in landscape since you arrived to now?
Yep, I will do that. Sorry about that. We've seen a dramatic change in the landscape. It's gone from Arctic tundra, where we had some grasses and lots of wet, glacier runoff. So lots of little small rivers, and now everything's frozen. Very little snow, but lots of snow drifts because the wind has just blown it all away. So it's gone from, we feel like we've been through 3 seasons already, and there are no trees that grow here, so everything just gets blown by the wind.
All right, well, let's jump to our next classroom right away. Well, we have a good connection. Miss Stutter's group are hanging out with us in Kelowna, British Columbia. Let me get their microphone turned on. There it is. How are we doing, Kelowna?
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
What's your question? Stand up.
Nice and close and nice and loud for us.
Why?
Why is it night all the time?
Why is it night all the time?
Awesome question. Hilde and Sunniva, why is it night all the time?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. It's where we are situated on the Earth. We are sort of close to the North Pole. And right now, the sun is lower than 6 degrees under the horizon. Until January the 19th, it's called a polar night. So we have now been in total darkness for almost 3 months. And we are so much looking forward to that the sun will come back. And actually, already in April, we will have April the 19th, we will have midnight sun. So it's where we are situated. That's why it's so dark. The sun doesn't reach all the way up here during winter.
All right, and George, I think you grabbed a little globe for us. Looks like you might want to add to that.
I don't have a globe, but this will do. So the Earth rotates, as we know, 1 revolution every single day. But the Earth doesn't rotate straight up and down. It's actually got a bit of a tilt to it, a 23-degree tilt. And it's because of that tilt now, we are angled, the northern hemisphere is angled away from the sun. And so the sun is going to be lower in the sky, and therefore the further north you go, the darker it gets. The southern hemisphere, for example, Australia, is angled towards the sun, and it's summertime there.
All right, perfect. We've got one more class to make sure we visit live. Mr. Gulhar's class is hanging out with us in Texas. Let me get their microphone turned on. How are we doing, boys and girls?
Good. Come on. All right, Emma's got a question for you.
We know about the water cycle in the temperate zone. Does it change in the polar zone?
That's a really good question. George, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. The water cycle is very similar in the Arctic as it is to temperate zones and even in the tropics. Of course, you have water that evaporates off of the sea. It cools, condenses, forms clouds. Those clouds rain down and then ends up on the land. However, in these northern climates, the precipitation that falls isn't always rain. Sometimes it's snow, and sometimes that snow lands up in the mountains. And that mountain snow gets compressed into glaciers. And it can take hundreds and hundreds of years for that snow to make it back down to the ocean. So imagine the time scale of the water cycle happening on a much, much longer period of time, like much, much longer. So the processes are the same, just the time scale can be much different.
All right, and I just double checked my fact. About 68.7% of our fresh water is in fact trapped in those glaciers. So that's It's a lot of water being held. So I'm going to turn the microphone on for Hilde and Sunniva. And we had a question a little bit earlier about the hardships you're facing living in the north. Do you want to talk a little bit about maybe the food and maybe a couple other things that are a little trickier for you living where you are right now?
What was it? The food, Joe?
Yeah, like a little bit about the hardships. How do you have to do things a little different being in the cabin so far north, 140 kilometers from your nearest neighbor?
Yeah, yeah. Well, we haven't seen people for a long, long time. We have to store all our food before we left. We have had one resupply, and we also need to take care of our food here at Bamsebu in order to try to, like we have eggs here, and we need to try to keep them from freezing, and we have to turn them around for not rotten. And yeah, so we have a lot of dried food and canned food. And also how me and Sunniva is going. It's we are training a lot since the weather is bad outside. We have to go outside to chop wood and collect ice and snow and stuff like that. And we have to go with our dog Etta, and we need some fresh air, obviously, even if it's a gale outside. But we're doing great. We train a lot inside and we communicate well. So I think we're doing. Of course, we have some discussions. We've been in a small hut for 4 months now, and it's the two of us. No other people to talk to. But I think we're doing just great.
All right, awesome. Well, Hilde and Sunniva, I have to thank you for today and for persevering. I know you're in a remote location, and I think the classroom's got a really good taste of just how hard it is to communicate from the polar regions. You rely on satellites, things like weather, things like the auroras can have an effect on those satellites. And yeah, I think it's amazing that we can connect from somewhere so far north and beam you into these classrooms all across North America.
It's amazing that you, Joe, can hold the threads of like all the way to the Arctic and classrooms in North Palm Beach, BC, Oklahoma, Kelowna, Texas. I mean, it's amazing. So thank you so much for giving us the opportunity, and for all you kids that joined the call today. Thank you. We have to get outside and feel the weather and let it actually take your senses, because the only way that we're going to protect our natural world is if we all kind of fall in love with it.
All right, absolutely. And George, a huge shout out to you. Thanks so much for giving some time today, sharing some of your polar experiences and just how things are changing in Svalbard. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Joe. And as always, I agree with what they're saying about if you want to protect something, you have to know about it and be excited about it. So I hope that this has maybe inspired some people to maybe learn more about these polar regions, because they are some of the most beautiful places on Earth and need to be preserved.
All right. Well, boys and girls, thank you so much for hanging out with us today. Thanks for persevering with the satellite tech. I'm going to turn the microphones on. Let's get really loud. I want a big goodbye and thank you for Hilde, for Sunniva, and for George. All right. Awesome work. George, thanks so much. Hilde, Sunniva, keep warm, and we look forward to our next connection.
Yeah, thank you. And that scream there was the best kind of storm coming through the phone. Best ever. Thank you so much, guys.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your weeks, and we'll see you on another Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event.
Thank you.